Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the global audience who have joined the summit. A very, very warm welcome to the People's Global Summit, co-building a new eco-social world, leaving no one behind. It is a great pleasure for me to be joining you today, this morning from London. My name is Najma Mohammed. I'm Policy Director at the Green Economy Coalition and one of the moderators for the summit over the next 4 days.
Hello, Najma. And hello, everybody. I echo Najma's comments and welcome everyone to this historic event. My name is Rory Trawl, the Secretary General of the International Federation of Social Workers, a co-facilitator of the summit, and along with Najma, a moderator for this event. This is the first time that people from communities, mass movements, global trade unions, United Nations agencies, international faiths, the Commonwealth, individuals, and many more have come together because we want to live in peace. We want to live in communities that provide safety and security for everyone. We want to live in a fair, respectful, and sustainable world that leaves no one behind.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you all for being here. People from around the world are joining this event, united in our commitment to local and global action and change for the sustainability of our planet, the safety of our climate, and the well-being of all people. We will start this session by giving you a brief explanation of how and why the summit is taking place. But what is really important is how you can make your voice heard throughout the next few days together.
The People's Global Summit was initiated by 26 diverse global organizations comprising hundreds of millions of people, representing different faiths, philosophies, rights-based movements, workforces, generations, traditions, and cultures. Facilitated by the International Federation of Social Workers and the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the partners have gathered with people from across the world, bridging movements for justice to create new ways to work together for sustainability and quality of life for all. Back to you, Najma.
So each of us in the summit has a task. Each of us is an owner of change and has a responsibility, whether we represent communities, organizations, governments, international bodies, or ourselves, to work together and generate actions for change for our shared futures. We're really looking forward to everyone's participation and contributions.
This People's Global Summit was inspired during the COVID pandemic. We rediscovered that we are able to honor and respect each other and take action for everyone's safety, recognizing our interdependence. Stories that we shared with each other revealed the strengths in our communities, and we grew to develop new ways of thinking so that we would not return to business as usual after the pandemic. The People's Global Summit has grown from these conversations. It has focused us to propose a new vision and actions for co-building a sustainable and fair, new ecological and social world, an eco-social world, where everyone has well-being and security.
Thank you, Rory. So this global discussion is built on solidarity around an eco-social agenda. It has led to the formation of new and fantastic partnerships, innovative ideas, and accelerated actions. The recognition that people need to work together to solve climate change, inequality, and injustice is reflected in the voices you will hear throughout the summit.
Thanks, Najma. The partners have facilitated this summit have in essence formed a global people's assembly. We recognise that the lofty pledges made by governments after the Second World War on peace, development and human rights have not been realised. Inequalities and fractures have grown. Poverty sits alongside extreme wealth. Nature has been degraded, leading to climate warming and environmental destruction. Millions of people have been displaced as a result, adding to the millions more displaced by conflict and violence. The governments that made these commitments have prioritised competition over collaboration, sovereignty over solidarity. They have not yet served the people they represent.
But people around the world, in many different movements, in many different places, are expressing their desire for a change in our relationship with each other and in how we are governed. This mass movement of protests about inequalities, injustice, discrimination, and for climate justice are now standing together. The summit partners, which include many of these movements, are committed to this global call for justice and sustainability. We're proposing that we develop a People's Charter that recognizes the strengths of communities and people to co-build sustainable and fair change based on the transfer of power to people.
A People's Charter that comprises our diversity, our commitment, our visions, and our experience. In the summit, all of us will need to contribute to the People's Charter for an eco-social world. The process has already started by people and communities submitting their contribution on what values, policies, and practices need to be developed to give everyone and the planet safety and security. During the summit, the Charter will take shape and be drafted from everyone's contributions. We invite you to participate in the wide range of events that will run over the next 24 hours, over the next 4 days. The Charter will be shaped by these discussions from your comments in each of the keynotes, the panels, the pre-recorded sessions, during the open mic sessions, and on feedback forms. The Charter will be a living document and will be initially submitted to the world leaders as they gather at the 2022 United Nations High-Level Political Forum and General Assembly. It will be submitted as an invitation for them to join us, but also as a call for action. As Najma has said, each of us owns this living document and has a responsibility, whether we represent communities, governments, international bodies, or ourselves, to work together to generate actions for change for our shared futures. We look forward to your participation and contributions. During the summit, rapporteurs will be working behind the scenes to collect everyone's ideas and draft a charter which will be presented on the summit website midway through the summit proceedings for your further comments. This draft will be finalised after all of the comments and contributions have been made, and it will be presented at the closing session.
Thank you, Rory. So this People's Global Summit will continue to promote and support people's assemblies at local, national, regional, and global levels to unlock the means to co-design and co-build a new eco-social world. Together, we will bring our local and global knowledge from our own lived experience working in communities and populations where transformative change is already taking place. Together, we can build hope and new systems that foster peace, confidence, and security for everyone, and making sure that no one is left behind. To officially open the summit, we commence with a presentation from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. He sits at the crossroads of global decision-making by our world leaders, and therefore offers a unique perspective on the changes required to achieve both justice and sustainability.
I'm pleased to greet the Global People's Summit. The United Nations Charter commits nations to work together to end conflict, promote human rights, and improve the well-being of all. Over the decades, humanity has achieved much. But today we face acute and indeed existential challenges. Conflicts, not least the ongoing brutal war in Ukraine, are causing death and suffering on a scale we hoped we would never see again. And unmet global challenges threaten to undo decades of progress. The triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and the destruction of biodiversity, an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that has exposed the frailties and inequities of our health, education, and social systems, and the lack of effective international solidarity. And now an acute food, energy, and finance crisis aggravated by the war in Ukraine, on top of the deep inequalities in the resources available in the recovery from COVID-19. Developing countries are the worst hit, but persistent inequalities and the disregard for fundamental human rights are dragging us all down, degrading our solidarity, and feeding violent extremism. We, the peoples, are being let down. We need to demand more from our leaders. Over the next few days, you will discuss your vision for a world that is socially and environmentally just. We have a blueprint, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Your responsibility and your right is to speak up and hold leaders to account for the commitments they have made and demand they act now. I commend you for your commitment. The United Nations will continue to work with you so global leaders can hear and respond to the voices of we, the peoples. Together, we can build a truly sustainable, carbon neutral and equitable world where no one is left behind. Thank you.
We really thank the UN Secretary General for contributing and supporting to this event today. He says it is our responsibility and our right to speak up and hold government leaders to account for the commitments they have made and demand that they act now. It is very encouraging to hear this call for action and a direct commitment from the highest level of the United Nations to work together with us, peoples and communities. It is our role now to consider how this change can happen and how to facilitate governments and communities coming together respectfully to co-design and co-build our new futures.
I fully agree, Rory. I think the speech really reflects the kind of transformational leadership that we need to address the challenges we face. And we can really see the United Nations commitment to this process as a historic and important turning point in the way we want the world to change. To follow this important message, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our opening keynote address. So Dr. Kumi Naidoo is a human rights and environmental activist from South Africa, currently serving as Professor of Practice for Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. He is a former head of Greenpeace and Amnesty International. He is also Global Ambassador for Africa Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, and a member of the Advisory Board of Transparency International. Dr. Naidoo will speak for 30 minutes, and then there will be time for questions, comments, and responses. We ask you to use and pose your questions in the comment section of the YouTube live stream of this event. And over to you, Kumi, the floor is yours. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Najma and Rory, and greetings, dear friends. I just want to make sure you see my presentation on the screen. I'm greeting you this morning from Johannesburg, where it's extremely cold. That's why you see I have a jersey, and where we are experiencing incredible electricity cuts. I'm on a hot spot at the moment without electricity, so I hope everything works out fine. I must confess that these days I'm more sort of anxious when I speak to people than when I was a young activist, because, and I can tell you in a story that speaking to a group of folks in the United States some years ago, spelling out the challenges that we face in the Q&A, somebody asked me, Kumi, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And then I said, of course I did. He inspired many people in our struggle in South Africa. And then the second question was, do you know what his most famous speech was called? And I, thinking it was a trick question, I gently answered, I have a dream. And the response was, yes, I have a dream. But when we hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The forests are disappearing, inequality is deepening, the oceans are rising, and so on. One of the challenges that we face right now, in that comes out of that story, is how do we find the right balance between speaking truth to power, not sanitizing how deep a crisis that humanity finds itself in on the one hand, but doing it in a way that inspires, that encourages, that motivates and celebrates participation. We need to make sure that our analysis, the pessimism of our analysis of this moment, can best be responded to by the creativity of our thought, action, and passions. We are, of course, experiencing a convergence of crises like never before. COVID-19 pulled back the failure of our current economic systems, our health systems, and much more. What we are seeing, though, is that we are reaching a boiling point, literally and figuratively, both in terms of climate, but also in terms of people's frustrations building up to the point where we are seeing a rise of resistance, as Najma noted in an introduction. Let us be very clear, therefore, about where we find ourselves in history. I do not think it's a dramatic statement to say that we are living in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the remaining years of this decade will determine what kind of future humanity has, or whether humanity will have a future at all. Given what we have just heard from the, oops, I think I got a problem. Given what we've just heard from the IPCC in 2018, would suggest that we are not even 10 years left now to get emissions to peak and start coming down. And in that context, we need to recognize that the window of opportunity to make our interventions and act is small, it's very small, and it is fast disappearing and fast closing. And I put this in a story just to make it very clear. In 2015, in June, I was in the Pacific and I learned a new slogan, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, when I met my colleagues in Paris, and they invited me to speak at a rally, and I was proudly about to start chanting 1.5 to stay alive. And they said, sorry, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan is 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive. And therefore, in this situation that we find ourselves in, I believe my...
Kumi, please give me an indication if you want me to shift the slides. I've started sharing from my side. Because,
okay, yes, please.
Yours was not coming through. Please give me an indication if you want me to move to the next slide.
Please do advance. Yeah, so what we are seeing is in fact a multi-layered set of challenges. And next slide, please. And we are now in a situation where the cognitive dissonance that we are seeing from our political and business leaders must be challenged very strongly. And we need to be saying that the pessimism of this moment, pessimism and cognitive dissonance are luxuries that we simply cannot afford, right? We are seeing the same tired old solutions that have never worked before being put forward as how we will get out of the crisis that we're in. And therefore, many young people and people of all generations are feeling despair about the current situation that we find ourselves in. However, here's the good news. Notwithstanding the one side of things getting bad, the challenges are rising, the war in Ukraine and in Ukraine by Russia and so on, creates a sense of melancholy. But on the positive side, let's be clear that those of us who've been around for long, for a couple of decades would say that there's never been a moment in our activist history where we can remember that there is such an appetite for significant structural and systemic change. And in that context, I think that we must remind ourselves what Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said when he said, we should all be comfortable with being prisoners of hope. This is a moment for hope, for informed hope, right? But a belief that in fact we have a moment here to push for big changes, not the baby step incremental rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as humanity sings kinds of stuff that we've been seeing from government for far too long, but real fundamental structural and systemic change. Next slide, please, Najwa.
Kumi, it seems to be stuck on my side. I'll try and sort it out or reshare. Please continue while I sort it out.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna, so then that raises the question of what is to be done, right? And the next slide. So I'm here drawing on the thinking that's coming out of this process of the People's Summit. And I'm gonna take you through the principles that are articulated there and just give you some language that, in my judgment, gives substance to each of these different points. So on the first one, on from market-driven economies, sustainable well-being society. Our economies are based on market economics that incentivizes destructive practices. For instance, GDP, for every time a tree is cut down or a mountain is mined, that equals an increase in GDP of a country. This market-driven economy and powers that protect and maintain it want us to believe that a sustainable society centered on the well-being of people and the planet is a far-fetched idealism. It is not. It is within our grasp if we have the imagination to believe in it and we have the courage to mobilize for it. But the reality is that this is not just true. In places around the world, we are seeing local bottom-up economies being built with the interest of rebuilding the harmony between people and planet. Many regions, cities, and even countries around the world have already started transitioning away from the top-down market-driven economic formulas that serve primarily the wealthy and the 1%. Next slide, please. Just go back for a second. I just want to make one point. It's not as if the environment has not been trying to scream at us, the whole external environment, about us needing to do this. Take the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. That was a teachable moment. That was a moment where humanity needed to listen, learn, and make big changes. But what we saw in response, once the crisis was managed, what we saw was system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. When what was needed then, and what is even more urgently needed now, is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And when we talk about a new eco-social contract in the context of thinking about the economy, we must be very clear. When we say that the social contract is broken, that is the terms of engagement and commitments between citizens and their leaders is broken, we must take care to say that it's not only that it's broken now, suddenly, after COVID or after the global financial crisis. The social contract has always been broken for certain constituencies of citizens. And let's put that on the table right now. For indigenous peoples, for women, for young people, for older persons. And then actually when you add it up, right, more people are excluded from feeling a sense of involvement and engagement and that the needs are being met than there are people that are included. Next slide, please, Najma. Environment. From exploitation to recognizing the rights of nature for sustainability, for sustainable coexistence. We must come to terms with the fact that our current struggle is not about saving the planet fundamentally, right? The reality is the planet does not need saving. Because when we, as a species, continue on this path of exploitation of natural resources, deforestation, overfishing, and decimating biodiversity, the result is that we will die out in the end. And the good news is that once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So everybody who's just worried about saving the planet, don't worry too much about it. Understand that the struggle really is about securing humanity's capability to survive on this planet. And as we've seen during the lockdown, it does not take much for Mother Nature to start to recover, regrow, and replenish. So the planet will be fine. When we are gone, the oceans will recover, the forests will regrow, and so on. The current struggle is a struggle to build a future where we can coexist with nature in a manner that ensures that for centuries and centuries to come, we will be able to live in a mutually interdependent relationship with nature. Next slide, Najma, please. So from national introspection to global citizenship. Now, herein lies the biggest catastrophe that we are dealing with right now. And ironically, the countries that historically preached human rights, preached democracy, preached good governance are the ones actually who are as complicit today in undermining all of those values, as well as being part of promoting fascism, right? So, let's name it. Donald Trump is a fascist, right? By whichever definition you want to look at, we need to start naming the people that are driving us in the direction of destruction. And so as we edge closer to the climate cliff and resources become more scarce, we also edge closer to the risk of deepening nationalism and nativism, which threatens to build more walls and borders. We need to ensure equal distribution of vital resources and to respect our diverse cultural, social roots, recognizing that national interests are secondary to global fairness and sustainability, in order to build a new eco-social contract. Refugees, displaced peoples, and migrants are already calling for immediate, meaningful dialogue and action with governments and international bodies to secure their future and security. The indigenous people's knowledge that was almost wiped out by colonialism, which was one of the worst impacts of colonialism, thankfully had resilience and is emerging and needs to be encouraged to emerge, because those indigenous knowledge systems, I would argue, are part of the solution to get us out of the mess that we have got to. Next slide, please. Business, from independent markets to sustainable cooperation. Yeah, I just want to say one simple thing, and that is that the biggest disease that humanity faces is not COVID, but a disease that we can call affluenza. Affluenza is a pathological illness where people have been led to believe that a good, meaning, decent life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. And that if you are doing good, it means you've accumulated so much. We need to challenge the very notion of how business happens. We need to contest the GDP notion, and I urge you to look into this publication by Lorenzo Ferramenti called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, the world's most powerful number. And part of the scale of change that we need to be thinking about moving forward is, in fact, contesting the very way in which GDP is measured. If we do not challenge the way growth is measured, right? Growth that comes with inequality and environmental destruction largely, growth without equity. If we don't do that, all the other initiatives that we are engaged in will not stand a chance to succeed, because this is so fundamental to the allocation of resources in society. Next one, Najma. Work, from being undervalued to recognition and decent working conditions. Today, as people in this conference knows, and social workers in particular, who have to pick up the effects of the absence of decent working conditions and so on, will say that today, ironically, more and more people appear to be working under indecent working conditions in a way that if we looked at 30 years ago and we looked at the projections where we are in terms of improving working conditions and so on, we would have imagined a completely different trajectory. But what we are seeing is that if we do not put decent work, which is the best and the most impactful strategy to get out of poverty, let's be very clear. There is nothing as powerful to help people move out of poverty as ensuring that there are decent work and decent working conditions, that they are paid well, treated fairly, their health is secured, and so on. Next slide, please, Najma. From state responsibility, from reactive public spending to public investment in well-being. Yeah, I think we need to be brutally honest with ourselves. We need to recognize that the overwhelming majority of states and the governments that preside over them for periods of time are failing dismally at multiple levels. And therefore, it is important for us to be taking a much more activist stance with regard to how we push our governments to do what is needed, which is to move from reactive public spending to public investment in well-being. There are clearly, I mean, I'll just give you an example. In South Africa, our people don't have water, don't have electricity at the moment, housing is challenged and so on. And our government decides to go spend 20 million rand in building a flag, you know, a national flag. You know, there are, from that obscene example, there are thousands of examples we can give where public spending is not being deployed to enhance well-being. And that is the phrasing that we need. Public spending for human well-being. I will offer that with no consultancy fee to the People's Summit to consider. Next one, Najma, please. So how do we get there? Next one. We need a complete reorientation of how we think about mobilization. And yeah, I think all of us in civil society must now recognize that this is a moment to tell no lies and claim no easy victories. This is not a moment for egos and legacies and so on. We are fighting for our children's future and their children's future. Their stakes are just far too high for ego and any other sort of thing to come into it. Now, yeah, we must be self-critical and think about what Albert Einstein said when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. We all need to look at what we have tried to do in good faith, right? And then say, what do we need to change, right? So, for example, being self-critical here, I think one of the worst mistakes I made through decades of activism in good faith was mistaking access for influence, right? Just because we get access to a particular parliamentary hearing or a meeting with the minister, even a meeting with the head of state, we have often hoped and misinterpreted that access for actual influence. The return on our investment, to put it in market terms, of engagement with governments has been pathetically bad in terms of return. And one of the things we need to do is shift our gaze from those with power, appealing to them, begging them for action, and make sure most of our gaze, I'm not saying we don't stop talking to those in power, but we have to recognize we have more power than those in governments right now in some ways. They need us to talk to them. They need the legitimacy from engagement. If we withhold our legitimacy of engagement that we give them, provided they seriously show that they are serious about their dialogue and it's not a box-ticking exercise, because in honest truth, for all the meetings I've had with heads of state, ministers, and so on, if I reflect on it, they were ritualistic exercises, right? We went in there knowing what they were going to tell us. They knew what we're going to tell them. We knew 99% what the outcome is going to be. They then tick off a box saying civil society consulted, and then we go back and tick off a box saying government advocated on or lobbied, right? So I want to end with this diagram where I say activism itself starts from a point of how people are excluded, marginalized, oppressed, and so on. And of course, that's where we need to start. But what happens, I think, is unwittingly, sometimes those of us, even in the leadership of some of these efforts, start imagining that the people that we're trying to mobilize, because of all of these injustices and exclusion that have come their way, we actually begin to think that they have much less agency than in reality they have. This diagram is about trying to shift that logic, that the task of all of us is to ensure that we are creating enabling conditions for people to participate in trying to save their children's futures on their own terms. If it's a single mother with 3 kids, then it is up to us to create the enabling conditions that she is able to participate in a way that makes most sense to her, even if it is 1 act a week or 2 acts a week. We have to break the notion of the activist is some bold, daring person who does X, Y, and Z. That is hurting us. We have to create a logic where if this is about all of us, and this is about changing everything. And to change everything, we need everybody to be involved. So I put 4 quadrants here where I talk about harnessing our autonomy, our creative participation, our wealth, and our consumption. And you have to read each of the outlying circles from the center. Just remember, people have power as litigators, being able to, in certain countries, and we've seen it, bring in court actions. They have powers as citizens and voters. Yes, many of our election systems are flawed and compromised and so on. But I would urge, flawed as it is, we should not walk away from those, from the political process. We need to find ways to push the political process to go beyond what it was optimally designed for while we try to transform it. And I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm hoping that you can see it on the screen. But I want to just go to harnessing our creative participation and give one example from there. One of the things we can learn from Steve Bannon and the right-wing fascists of the world right now is that they are much more smarter at listening to the critics and looking at what the critics do, and they'll draw from it, right? So, for example, do you know that Steve Bannon and his ilk, one of the main ideological sort of inspirations to them is Antonio Gramsci, the Italian socialist. And they take the idea of hegemony, the idea of respecting culture and organizing people in, and now they've contorted it and distorted it, of course, right? But one of the things we can learn is that too much of our work, right? Too much of our activism and our narratives is all about facts, all about reaching people through their heads, right? Now, I'm not saying we must give up on facts like the right wing does, absolutely not. But we can be true to facts, but we can also try to present our facts that they speak to people's hearts, right? You know, going on about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, going on about 350 parts per million and so on, let's be blunt about it. Most of our families, right, everybody in this conference, I guarantee you that the majority of our extended families, if we go and ask them, do you really know what we are talking about when we go on about 1.5 or 350 parts per million? The answer would be no, right? So we need to start thinking about how we communicate, not as people who've had the privilege of education and access and so on, but how do we shift our gaze to where people are, understand more deeply how we actually build narratives from people's own understanding rather than us projecting our own consciousness on people. The next one, that one. So I want to reiterate the Albert Einstein quotation here. If we do not, as change makers, have the courage to contest and challenge even the way we operate, even the way our organizations are structured, even the way sometimes we replicate some of the injustices that we are critical of in the broader environment within our own organizational cultures, unless we're able to do all of that, we will not be rising to the challenge of the moment that we find. Next one. So I end with saying that we, you know, people ask the question, is it too late on climate? I come from a city called Durban, which 8 weeks ago had what people are calling a rain bomb, right? A rain bomb, so much of rain that 600 people died. Now, I'm sure most of you internationally would not have heard that 600 people died from a climate event in Durban, or might have just heard a little about it because it didn't happen in Belgium or Germany. That's a reality we live in when lives are lost in the global south. they are not taken seriously, right? In terms of mainstream media and so on. And I just want to end with that appeal in one of the things, one of the principles about going beyond nationalism, and end with these words. Climate change is a horrific challenge when you combine it with inequality and all the attendant injustices. But there is an opportunity in climate change. It allows us the possibility to break down decades and decades and decades of division, of where we've been organized, we've been divided north, south, east, west, developed, developing. Climate change is saying to us, we either get this right as rich nations and poor nations uniting and acting together, and hopefully will save most of our children and their children's futures. Otherwise, in the end, true, people in the global south who've contributed least are paying the first and most brutal price, but nature does not negotiate, and nature does not know any boundaries, and eventually we will all be engulfed. So on that somewhat pessimistic note, I say, let's use that as motivation to mobilize a level of global participation that we have never seen before, because that's what it will take. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup. Asante sana.
Thank you so much, Kumi, for that inspiring and sobering and hopeful words that you've just shared with us. And thank you to everybody that's joined us for the live stream on YouTube. Please, it's really great to see where you're all calling in from the world and listening in. Please do put your questions. Kumi, I'd like to kickstart us. So there was a moment when you were speaking, probably when you were, I felt, it was very emotional for me listening to you. You spoke about, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his appeal that, that we have to be prisoners of hope. Sometimes I look at the generation as someone who's worked on climate and environment issues now for a good 2 decades and plus. I think climate anxiety and the anxiety of the science, I know I ask myself sometimes, I wish the science was wrong. We're dealing with the sobering reality of the science. And then like you, I have an opportunity to speak to 11 Pacific Island nations. And I just know this is not going to happen in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It's happening now. And sadly, it's the most vulnerable, as you've noted, the most vulnerable communities that are being pushed, further and further into that vulnerability and marginalization, both within countries and, between nations. Because to be frank, it's the countries that have done, the least to contribute to this global, climate change, which is an outcome of our affluenza, the global affluenza that's been driven, by the industrialized nations of the world. But I wanted to delve a bit more to start off into that third final slide that you shared, the one where you really spoke about the agency of people, and cultivating hope, because I felt myself going through various emotions, really emotional when I understood that for me, as someone working on climate and environment, I've got to keep my hope cup full, all the time, because the science is so sobering. The inaction is so shocking. And yet, we have the hope, we have the young people, on the streets, the most sensible voices in the world at this moment, listening to scientists. So I think, Kumi, to kick us off and to infuse our summit and our discussions with that hope and that energy that we need to tackle these challenges. Can we talk a little bit more about, where you're beginning to see, this hope emerge, this action and this energy for change? Because I think that positive lens helps a lot.
Thank you, Najma. Firstly, let's be very clear. One is not talking about false hope. That's why I started by saying the window of opportunity is small and is closing fast. And it's closed for some people. For the 600 people who died in Durban 10 weeks ago, it's too late for them, as well as for thousands and thousands of people losing their lives on a regular basis now from climate impacts. Now, I want to just speak to people in this audience and people in the world who have themselves come to the conclusion that it's too late to act on climate. That our politicians and business people have brought us to a point. Now let's just, I don't want to accept that, right? Even if the window of opportunity is small, we need to push that window of opportunity wider. That's the task that's ahead of us. But let's, for argument's sake, take the pessimistic view, right? That it's too late. Even if it's too late, I refuse to accept that those that brought us to this point can get away without accountability. So long as we are breathing, so long as we have energy in our body, we continue to fight and we expose those that brought us to this point. That might not sound the biggest motivation in the world, but I can tell you that given the scale of the damage that has been done, and let's be very clear, it's now totally transparent that those that had the power to know had the power to know. And they either hid the facts about how dangerous the fossil fuel industrial military complex is, or they've consciously lied about it using hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's what I loved about some of the thinking in the proposed charter that's emerging from the summit. For me, what's most important was not the 6 things that I ran through there. What's more important is the commitment to participation, right? Because participation is going to offer us 2 things. Participation on a scale that we've never seen. One, it offers us the best chance to push our policy makers to move as fast as we can. But there's another thing that participation is giving us. Participation is giving us community. It's giving us home. It's giving us solidarity, which is all going to be critically needed for the years and decades ahead as things get harder. So what I said to Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future when Amnesty International gave them the Ambassador of Conscience Award, I said, please don't let the Donald Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Modis and the Orbans of the world deprive you of your childhood, right? While you fight, right? Celebrate each other, dance, sing, have fun. And that's why on that creative participation autonomy, let me just say, that is so important, because when we think about how we communicate with people who do not have educational skills or who are not even literate, right? Because they've been deprived of education. How do we reach them? We reach them through song, through dance, through culture, right? And we need to celebrate the diversity of cultures that are in the world, respect it, embrace it, and work with it. Because we need to recognize the biggest threat we face in the current moment is not the repressive state apparatus, by which I mean army, police, formal laws, and so on. Bad as it is, because that constrains the space for public life. What is the biggest challenge we face is the ideological state apparatus, by which I mean the framework for education, framework for religion, the funding of arts and culture, and most critically important, the framework for communications and media. So in the US, for example, just to give an example, you got 40% of the people just under watching Fox News. And Fox, within the US media establishment and framework, it would appear they have not only the right to have their own opinions, they have the right to have their own facts, what they very honestly call alternative facts, right? So we need to understand that the communications environment is stacked against us, and our creativity is going to be critically necessary in terms of how we compensate for that.
You remind me of, I was watching a news insert with my 14-year-old son, and it was, the storming of the White House, and you had Republicans saying this was just a normal day visit to the White House. And he was asking, well, Mom, look at the pictures. I mean, that's not a normal visit to a parliament or a state institution. You go in, you get a tour. I mean, well, certainly they don't look like they're going on a tour. And yet, as you're saying, Kumi, there's just the cognitive dissonance, as you've mentioned in your speech. It's just, staggering when you see how we can stare the truth, the evidence in the face, and yet, deny. And I think, that is something that I think young people, with their honesty and their innocence, are asking, questions that us as activists and scientists and policy advocates just have been asking in diplomatic ways, but they just ask it, straight up. Kumi, one question that we have before I hand over to Rory to share a question from his side is that you said that we need to start speaking, the language of people that we want to engage with, and coming together to this People's Summit. It's a wide array of organizations coming together, working on public health, social work, working on climate change, working with faith communities. And so we find, working on cultural revival. So the language we're using as, coming together under the People's Summit is different. And yet we've come together under this agenda that we want, a new eco-social world, a world that leaves no one behind. How can we start speaking, the language of this, the climate and environment crisis, in a way that we connect, as you said, with people's hearts, and we inspire for action. The community that's already the International Federation of Social Workers, it's hundreds and thousands of, social workers on the ground in communities. You're working on these issues of work and safety and security and health and well-being. Over to you, Kumi, your reflections.
So I think we have to be starting with the principle that not everybody is facing the same daily lived reality. Repression is different. Like, for example, there are 4 environmental activists killed every week, according to Global Witness, right? When you average it out. Now, that might be very shocking to some, but if you come from Latin America, where the bulk of the murders are happening, it's not such a shock, right? So we need to be building resilience and building. What I loved about the narrative that I was seeing here is the use of the word well-being, right? Because this is what our economy, we need to be build a well-being economy, a well-being education system, a well-being, food system, and so on. And to do that, of course, given where we are, is not easy at all. But there is good news, that all those that hold power in different institutions know that the current system is broken. They know it cannot endure. Whatever they say in public, is one thing. But I would say today, the recognition that big change is possible is very, very, is becoming more and more persuasive. But in terms of how we communicate to people, right? So my one challenge then to be to our effort here, right? What I would say is that before we finalize the charter, we should do an exercise. We should ask all of us, the thousands of people that have contributed, to please take 5 days, right? I have a 5-day window where they take the charter and go discuss it with their families and friends and ask them the question, how can this be made in language that is more accessible and so on? And let's be honest, right? Even social contract as a frame, it's not a popular thing. But I am convinced that within the creativity that exists within us, we can come up with something that speaks to people's hearts, right? That will be the social contract, but will be something. I'm not creative enough to come up with it, but I refuse to believe that within the creativity that exists within us, that if we apply ourselves, we cannot. I've seen it happen in many, many contexts. During the anti-apartheid struggle, when most of our people were deprived of education, I remember in 1983, when I was in my late teens, in my city, the slogan that emerged that just, we were talking about democracy and good governance and what in our messaging, one person, one vote. And you know what slogan just captured people and mobilized on a scale never before? One long Zulu word, asina mali, we don't have money, right? That slogan just resonated with people in a way that all our very well-worded pamphlets were going way above people's heads. So if there's maybe one way, I think, is also not to homogenize communities. I think we often homogenize things when we shouldn't. Always understand specificity, difference, and so on. If we embrace it and respect it. By the way, what Bannon and them did when Trump got elected, they recognized it and they manipulated it through lies and half-truths and so on. I'm absolutely not saying we should be doing that. I think if we ever engage in the enterprise of misinformation, disinformation, and so on, just to get people to support us, we would have lost our soul. So I'm certainly not saying we should do that. But respecting diversity in its truest sense is critically needed. And maybe the one last thing I would say is, right, what is our job as change makers? Is it our job to come up with a position, go to the world, and mobilize all the people who already agree with us, right? And then we create one echo chamber, another echo chamber, and then we talk to each other often, and then we convince each other of how great our cause is and how wonderful we are and how history depends on us and so on. And we get more and more convinced in the righteousness of our cause. But because we're spending so much time talking to each other, we imagine that that's what's happening everywhere, when in fact, people are shifting more and more away from us. So let's say, for example, I want to offer a jargon now. What we need is syntropic framing, okay? But what I mean by this is you speak truth to power, don't sanitize how deep the crisis we're in, but do it in a way that is consciously trying to develop narratives that builds bridges to those that we disagree with. Now, I've upset a lot of people. I've upset a lot of people when I've said that our task as change makers and activists is to learn to love the people that voted for Brexit, to learn to love the people that voted for Trump, to learn to love the people that voted for Modi and Bolsonaro. They are not our enemies. They have been misled, misinformed, lied to, etc. So let's say one of the things is clear from this conference, we need to build a new economy, right? Now, there's two ways we can frame it. Assuming we say, okay, the economy is broken, it's beyond repair, we need something new, right? There's one way we can frame it, which is smash the capitalist system, right? If you say that, assuming the day before you launch the campaign, we are here, right? The people are going to launch the campaign here, and all the people disagree in different gradations are here. The day we launched the campaign, guess what has happened? We've pushed people even further away from us, because people who don't really have a vested interest in the capitalist system but have been led to believe they do, right, going to feel threatened. Now, what do we lose if we came up with a different slogan? And we came up with a slogan like this: let's build an economy that includes everybody and doesn't hurt the environment. What do we lose by saying that, right? So sometimes I want to say self-critically, activism tries to speak to themselves so that we feel more politically, perfect and all of that, when what we need to be doing is humbling ourselves and really understanding where people's conversations are and building from it. Because I refuse to accept that social change work is simply about mobilizing the people that we already agree with. The enterprise before us to build a new eco-social world has to include winning over the people that have drifted away from human rights, drifted away from recognizing the rights of trade unions and labor federations to exist, to reduce women's rights as we're seeing in the United States right now, and so on. So, yeah, I hope I answered your question a little bit.
You did, Kumi, and more. So thank you so much for that. Rory, I'll hand over to you. I know you've got one or two questions you'd like to ask Kumi.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Just first of all, to all the people watching on YouTube, if you have a question for Kumi, please just write it in the chat and we'll read it. We'll read it out from here. And Kumi, you've got lots of people saying how much they deeply appreciate your wisdom, your words. In that chat, people are joining from all over the world, saying hello from different countries. So we just have another 5 or 8 minutes to go in this session. And just while we're just waiting to see if there's any particular questions that people want to ask, Kumi, I want to just reflect something to you. In many of your speeches, your writings that you've made over the years, you talk about leaderful societies. And I think that's a huge thing that we need to reflect on in this summit as we go forward. As a social worker, I'm really aware that there are leaders in every community, many, many, many leaders, people making sure children are safe in unofficial roles, informal roles, making sure that elderly people are supported, making sure that recycling systems happen, making sure that the streets get fixed when they're broken, and those sorts of things. And that happens worldwide, because as a practicing social worker, you see it and you meet these people because they're actually the key actors of change. But the states, the governments, tend to be completely blind to them as if they don't exist. And sometimes I think our own global organizations are also not sufficiently aware of how we recognize the strength in communities and its key role in actual social transformation. And we get all caught up in the system of being top down. It's like a culture that sucks us all in. As someone who's done a lot of thinking and reflecting on leaderful societies, is there any comments that you'd like to add for the summit for us to consider as we
Thank you. Thank you, Rory, for that excellent question. Let me just say that this global versus local tension, right? In the early 1980s, there was a slogan that said, think globally, act locally. What was behind that slogan was, irrespective of what you were trying to address at the local level, you needed to understand how global processes, global discourse, global power constrained or expanded what you could or could not achieve at the local level. Then, come 1990, a feminist movement from the global south called Dawn, Development Alternatives for Women in a New Era, they began to say, hang on a minute, if we think globally and we act solely locally, and in reality, power is shifting around economy, around patents, around so many things on environment and all outside of the national space, then we'll be removing ourselves from where power resides. And then people said, oh, maybe we need to think locally or what our needs are. And if real power is at the global level, we fight at the global level, right? Obviously, it was never as clear cut as that. We need to fight both the global level, we need to fight at the local level. I think, Rory, what you're identifying, though, is correct, which is that sometimes we've not got the proportionality right. We have forgotten that all politics is local, right? We have forgotten that, you know, whatever exists here at the global level, at whatever global institution we might be or network and so on, it is not real without what people are doing on the ground. We exist only because of people on the ground. We don't exist for ourselves, right? You can't win a battle. And that's why sometimes you see we win certain struggles and get a policy language at a COP or a UN summit and so on, and we get really orgasmic about that victory. And then we realize, actually, at the end of the day, these guys signed there, they flew back home, and by the time they landed back in their own capitals, they even forgotten what they signed. And that is why right now, we need to also recognize the critical importance of leaderful societies and leaderful movements. For one reason, simple reason, is repression. Repression is on the rise, right? And if we centralize power around a handful of leaders, that's just tactically a bad thing to do, because leaders can get killed, can be arrested. And let's be very clear. As the current system comes under more contestation and runs out of options, you have to budget. We have to budget, sadly, we have to budget that there will be greater repression that will come with it, and we are seeing signs of it already. But the principle of ensuring that we are, and by the way, Rory, that infographic, People's Pathways to Global Justice, is exactly speaking to what you are saying. We need to create leaderful societies. So, for example, in a community, if there's an artist who can do murals, right, and can teach younger people to draw murals with some of the messages from the People's Charter, for example. We need to create an enabling environment for we have to almost disaggregate different parts of society. What can librarians offer? How can librarians contribute? How can teachers contribute? And of course, social workers have a critical role to play in this enterprise, because you as the community have some of the skills of connecting people, of organizing things, on helping to provide support services and so on. And I would say that the social work community is one of the communities that has a huge potential to play in really pushing this notion of leaderful societies, and also developing the tools and the resources that gives people confidence that they can be leaders. Right? The main problem we have is people, through media, through how the government speak, through how governance happens, have generally been said, you are a beneficiary, right? You're a beneficiary, wait until we give you a service. And my main message is how we create leaderful societies is to shift the logic that there are victims, that there are survivors, that there are beneficiaries, there are recipients and all. We need to kill all of that language and say, we are citizens. We are citizens, and as citizens, yes, we can expect some of those rights and so on for you, but we have voice and we have the right to participate, and we must refuse to accept that democracy can be reduced to singular act of voting once every 4 or 5 years, and then whoever gets elected, however small that mandate is, then believe they have a blank check to do whatever they want. We need to say that representative democracy, elections, is only part of democracy. But what makes democracy real is participatory democracy, so how people are able to participate between elections. And when governments fail to do that, they are failing democracy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Kumi. Thank you so much. And I think we all agree that the voting every 4 years in the privacy of a voting booth is not democracy. It doesn't engage people in terms of making decisions that affect their lives. And I think there's a huge expressed commitment across all the people that have so far contributed to the summit that transferring power to people is the key objective of this new phase, this new era that you've identified in your keynote speech as being our time now is greater than any other time for effecting change. In your answers, you've actually commented on many of the questions that have come up in the chat. People were asking, do we need more organizing skills in communities or facilitation skills? People are asking what books to read, and many comments and questions. And perhaps if you have time, because we don't have time to have more verbal conversation right now for this address, you could actually respond to some of those questions in chat. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. You started off with saying our challenge is to release our creativity and our compassion, all of us. And I think that you've really modeled that and shown that to us all. Thank you so much, Kumi.
Thank you. Good luck with the summit, and I'll be following.
Very good. Najma and I are now looking forward to seeing you and everyone else in the sessions that come up. Whether they're pre-recorded or live sessions, we've all got the opportunity to contribute. And as people have said in the process so far, an obligation to contribute as being a part of a leaderful society. To do this on the program, online or on the program that you've downloaded, just click on the session and then you will end up in a place where you can make a contribution. Over to you, Najma.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you very much, Kumi. I think you've set the tone for us to unleash, the hope, the creativity, the energy, and the commitment from this incredible array of organizations and communities and individuals that have come together around the summit. The summit offers a lot of opportunities to make your voice heard as a member of this movement working for an eco-social world. We look forward to interacting with you in the sessions, and we will both be back with you again tomorrow at 1:30 UTC for the presentation of the draft People's Charter. And in the meantime, enjoy the forthcoming sessions that you can access through the summit program. And it's been a wonderful start to, I think, an incredible 4 days. Looking forward to meeting with all of you in the coming 4 days. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.